Welcome back to Raul Effect, where we uncover the hidden psychology behind relationships, attachment, and emotional growth so you can stop chasing confusion and start choosing clarity. Have you ever felt impossible to forget someone, even though they kept pulling away from you? What if the real reason isn't love alone, but a hidden psychological pattern that's quietly keeping you emotionally trapped? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why this cycle happens, how it affects both of you, and most importantly, how to finally break free without losing yourself. Have you ever met someone who made you feel incredibly close one moment, yet left you feeling completely unsure of where you stood the next? Someone who seemed to see you in a way no one else ever had, but then suddenly became distant without explanation. Stay with me until the end, because once you understand the psychology behind this pattern, you'll stop blaming yourself and begin seeing the entire experience from a completely different perspective. These situations rarely begin with obvious warning signs. In the beginning, everything feels natural. Conversations flow effortlessly, the chemistry feels genuine, and being around them seems easy. There's a sense that they truly understand you, and for a while it feels like you found someone capable of building something meaningful. Then, almost without noticing, the atmosphere changes. Their responses become less frequent. Their enthusiasm slowly fades. The warmth that once felt so consistent begins turning into emotional distance, and you're left wondering what changed. You replay conversations in your mind, searching for the moment everything shifted. Every message, every interaction, every small detail gets analyzed over and over. Yet, no matter how much you think about it, you can't find a clear answer. The hardest part is that nothing officially ends. There is no honest conversation, no clear goodbye, and no real closure. Instead, there's simply silence and uncertainty. That uncertainty is what traps the mind. When something ends clearly, we can process it, grieve it, and eventually move forward. But when there are unanswered questions, the brain keeps trying to solve a puzzle that has no obvious solution. You begin asking yourself painful questions. Did they ever really care? Was the connection genuine? Why does this affect me so deeply while they seem completely fine? Little by little, your emotional state becomes connected to their behavior. If they move closer, you feel hopeful again. If they pull away, you question your value. This doesn't happen because you're weak or overly emotional. It's a normal psychological response. The human brain naturally becomes attached to uncertainty. When someone gives affection and then suddenly removes it, your nervous system begins craving the return of those positive feelings. Over time, it stops being only about the person. It becomes about chasing the emotional reward you once experienced. Ironically, the inconsistency itself often strengthens the attachment. That is one reason letting go can feel so incredibly difficult. You're not always holding on because they're the perfect partner. You're holding on because unpredictable emotional patterns are incredibly difficult for the brain to release. At the same time, there's another part of this dynamic that often goes unnoticed. Someone with avoidant attachment doesn't usually experience emotional closeness the same way you might. Intimacy can activate feelings of pressure instead of comfort. It isn't necessarily because they don't care. In many cases, they care deeply, but become emotionally overwhelmed far more quickly than they know how to handle. As the relationship grows closer, their nervous system may interpret that closeness as a threat rather than safety. Fear of losing independence, fear of emotional dependence, or fear of becoming vulnerable begins taking over. To regain emotional balance, they instinctively create distance. That distance is often misunderstood. It doesn't automatically mean you weren't important. It often reflects the way their nervous system has learned to protect itself. This creates one of the most painful mismatches in relationships. You naturally respond to love by moving closer. They often respond to emotional intensity by needing more space. While you're trying to repair the connection, they're trying to reduce emotional pressure. Without realizing it, both people begin reinforcing the very cycle they desperately want to escape. You reach out more, they withdraw further. You invest more emotionally, they become even more distant. Eventually, your attention shifts almost entirely toward them. You start waiting for messages, reading into every word, noticing every change in tone, and holding on tightly to brief moments of warmth because they remind you of how everything felt in the beginning. Deep inside, you know something isn't right. Yet you continue hoping the relationship can return to what it once was. That hope becomes the trap. You're no longer chasing the person standing in front of you today. You're chasing the version of them who made you feel deeply chosen, emotionally understood, and completely alive during the beginning of the relationship. Your mind keeps telling you that if those moments existed once, they must still be possible. One of the hardest truths to accept is that not every intense connection is meant to become a lasting relationship. Some people enter our lives to reveal parts of ourselves we never fully understood. They expose attachment wounds. They reveal emotional habits. They show us how much of ourselves we're willing to sacrifice just to avoid losing someone. Those relationships may not always bring stability, but they often bring awareness. Once that realization begins to settle in, your perspective slowly changes. You stop making yourself responsible for someone else's emotional distance. You stop searching for answers from someone who isn't able to provide them. You stop ignoring your own emotional needs simply to keep the relationship alive. Even then, you may still find yourself caught in the same emotional cycle, wondering why something that felt so meaningful also feels so painful. That's because this experience isn't only about emotions. It's also about attachment patterns, nervous system responses, past conditioning, and two very different ways of experiencing closeness colliding with one another. Until those patterns are understood, the same relationship dynamics often repeat themselves. But when you finally understand what's happening beneath the surface, something much bigger changes. You don't only begin seeing them differently, you begin understanding yourself in a completely new way. And that's where real healing starts. Still, there's one question that continues to trouble so many people. Why is it that even after you've decided to move forward, after you've promised yourself you're finished with the relationship, something still keeps pulling you back? You create distance. You focus on yourself. You slowly rebuild your peace. Then, just as you begin feeling emotionally steady again, they return. Maybe it's a message. Maybe it's a simple reaction. Maybe it's only a small reminder of their presence. Yet suddenly, everything you worked so hard to rebuild begins feeling uncertain again. It's almost as though you've been pulled back into the same emotional cycle without even realizing it. And understanding why that keeps happening may be the most important piece of the entire puzzle. This is exactly why the experience becomes so difficult to understand. After a while, it no longer feels like you're making a conscious choice to stay emotionally connected. Instead, it feels as though something keeps pulling you back no matter how hard you try to move forward. You don't wake up one morning deciding to stay attached. It happens quietly over time. What begins as simple curiosity slowly turns into reflection, then constant thinking, and before long, that person becomes a regular part of your inner world. What feels mysterious actually has a very real psychological explanation. When someone leaves a strong emotional impact, but the relationship never truly reaches a clear ending, your brain doesn't register it as complete. Instead, it keeps treating the experience as unfinished, and the human mind naturally seeks closure. It continues revisiting old conversations, replaying memories, and searching for answers that never fully arrive. Think of it like a conversation that suddenly stopped halfway through. Even if life continues moving forward, that unfinished exchange stays quietly active in the background. It doesn't always dominate your thoughts, but it keeps resurfacing during quiet moments, when you're alone, when your mind finally has room to wander. That's why letting go often feels so much harder than people expect. Physical distance doesn't automatically create emotional resolution. To your brain, someone being gone isn't the same as something feeling complete. Now add inconsistency into that picture. One day they're warm and engaged, the next they're distant. They appear, disappear, reconnect, and pull away again. That unpredictable pattern creates a powerful response inside the nervous system because your brain begins associating that person with emotional reward, but never knows when that reward will arrive. And unpredictability doesn't create peace. It creates craving. You aren't simply remembering them anymore. You're unconsciously waiting for the next moment of connection, even if part of you wishes you weren't. Without realizing it, you begin watching for patterns. You notice how long it has been since they reached out. You read meaning into silence. You analyze changes in communication that may not even have a clear explanation. Gradually, Your emotional system adapts to inconsistency. Because steady attention becomes rare, every small moment of connection suddenly feels incredibly valuable. A simple message or brief conversation can feel much bigger than it actually is, because it temporarily interrupts the uncertainty. That's why walking away often feels emotionally incomplete. Something inside resists it, not necessarily because the relationship is healthy, but because your nervous system has started linking relief with their return. At the same time, this dynamic usually isn't affecting only one person. Even if the avoidant seems calm or emotionally unaffected, they often experience changes beneath the surface as well. When your behavior begins changing, when you stop chasing, stop reacting the same way, or stop making yourself constantly available, they notice that shift. They may not consciously analyze it, but they feel that something familiar has changed. The emotional pattern they've grown accustomed to is no longer operating the way it once did. The certainty they unconsciously relied upon disappears, and suddenly they no longer know exactly where they stand with you. That uncertainty creates its own discomfort. As a result, they sometimes reconnect, not necessarily because everything has suddenly become clear, but because they're responding to the disruption in the emotional pattern. Sometimes it's a brief message. Sometimes it's a casual check-in. Sometimes they simply reappear after weeks of silence as though nothing happened. On the surface, those moments may seem small. Emotionally, however, they often restart the entire cycle. Hope returns. You begin wondering if this time things will finally be different. Maybe they needed space. Maybe they're ready now. Maybe the relationship is finally moving in the right direction. Without realizing it, your mind begins focusing on possibility instead of history. Then, before long, the same sequence appears once again. Closeness, distance, silence, confusion, repeat. Eventually, self-doubt starts replacing confidence. You question whether you're asking for too much. You wonder whether you're too emotional. You replay conversations, looking for mistakes, trying to discover the exact moment everything changed. In reality, the problem is often much simpler. You're deeply invested in a relationship that lacks consistency, and without consistency, emotional safety struggles to exist. When emotional safety is missing, the mind remains alert. It keeps scanning for signs, searching for meaning, anticipating changes, and trying to predict what might happen next. Even while living your everyday life, part of your attention remains tied to the relationship. You're physically present. Mentally, you're still waiting. Over time, that constant state of emotional monitoring becomes exhausting. Not because dramatic things are happening every day, but because your mind never fully relaxes. Your nervous system stays prepared for the next emotional shift. Little by little, instability begins feeling normal. You start adjusting to unpredictability instead of questioning it. You mistake emotional intensity for emotional depth simply because intensity has become familiar, while consistency feels unfamiliar. Yet, even after everything, the connection doesn't completely disappear. A song reminds you of them. A familiar place brings memories back. A quiet evening suddenly fills your mind with thoughts you believed were gone. Those unexpected moments create the feeling that the story is still unfinished. Part of you keeps believing there's one final conversation, one explanation, or one future version of the relationship that will finally make everything make sense. That hope quietly remains alive. You imagine the connection eventually becoming what it once seemed capable of becoming. But while that hope continues, something else slowly begins growing inside you: awareness. Instead of only reacting emotionally, you begin recognizing patterns. You notice the same cycle repeating itself in different forms, but always producing the same emotional result. And once those patterns become visible, it's almost impossible to ignore them again. You realize this isn't only about how you feel anymore. It's about how the relationship has gradually influenced your thoughts, your decisions, your emotional energy, and even the way you see yourself. That's where the biggest shift begins. Your attention slowly turns inward. Instead of constantly analyzing their behavior, you begin examining your own. You notice how often you minimized your own needs just to keep the connection alive. You recognize how many times you overextended yourself, accepted uncertainty, or stayed silent because losing the relationship felt more frightening than losing your own peace. You begin seeing moments when you ignored your own discomfort simply because uncertainty still felt easier than complete absence. And accepting that truth isn't easy. But it's often the first real step toward breaking the cycle for good. The difficult truth is that you weren't simply sharing the relationship. Without realizing it, you had become the person carrying most of it. You kept the connection alive by reaching out first, filling emotional gaps, explaining away silence, and holding on whenever things became uncertain. Little by little, the balance disappeared. Yet you kept believing that if you loved harder, understood them better, or waited a little longer, things would eventually become stable. Realizing this isn't comforting at first. In fact, it can feel painful because it forces you to let go of the belief that equal effort was always there. It challenges the hope that everything would naturally improve if you were patient enough. But hidden inside that uncomfortable realization is the beginning of real freedom. Something starts changing within you. You stop reacting to every shift in their behavior. You stop explaining yourself over and over. You stop searching for reassurance every time they become distant. Not because you've become cold or stopped caring, but because awareness has replaced automatic reaction. Once you truly recognize a pattern, it's almost impossible to ignore it again. And when you can clearly see the cycle, you naturally stop participating in it the way you once did. You begin understanding something that changes everything. Every time you gave more than was being returned, it didn't create security. It only made the imbalance even greater. Slowly, you begin reclaiming your emotional energy. It isn't easy because part of you still hopes things could become what they once seemed capable of being. That hope doesn't disappear overnight. But alongside it, another voice begins growing stronger. A quieter voice. A wiser voice. One that gently reminds you to choose peace instead of emotional chaos. Clarity instead of confusion. And self-respect instead of endless uncertainty. That's when life starts feeling different. You're no longer acting from old habits. You're no longer making decisions based purely on fear of losing someone. Instead, you're responding from a place of emotional awareness. You're protecting your own peace instead of constantly trying to protect the relationship. That change naturally transforms the entire dynamic. Not because you're trying to make someone miss you, not because you're following a strategy, but because the emotional energy you once gave away without limits is no longer freely available. The constant access they were used to slowly begins disappearing. And people notice when that happens. Maybe not immediately, maybe not consciously, but they notice. The emotional certainty they relied upon is no longer guaranteed. They no longer know they can step away and return whenever they choose without anything changing. For perhaps the first time, they experience uncertainty too. The version of you who was always waiting, always available, always ready to reconnect is no longer showing up in the same way. That creates space. Space they may never have experienced before. Space for reflection. Space for self-awareness. Space to recognize what the relationship had become. This is also the point where many people unintentionally restart the cycle. The moment they notice even the smallest sign of renewed interest, they immediately return to old behaviors. They become emotionally available again. They ignore the lessons they learned, and before long, the familiar pattern quietly begins all over again. But if you stay grounded in your growth, something much deeper develops. Your emotional stability no longer depends on what they do. Their attention no longer determines your mood. Their silence no longer destroys your peace. For the first time, your emotions belong to you instead of the relationship. From that place, your perspective naturally changes. You stop being impressed by temporary effort. You stop mistaking inconsistency for passion. You stop confusing emotional intensity with emotional security. This is what genuine healing looks like. It isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It's an internal shift that quietly changes everything. Once that transformation takes place, you don't become the same person you used to be. Even if they return, even if they reach out again, even if they genuinely want another chance. You respond from a completely different place. There is less urgency, less emotional dependence, more patience, more clarity, more self-control. That inner clarity becomes your greatest strength, not because it gives you power over someone else, but because it gives you control over your own choices. Eventually, the outcome itself becomes less important. You're no longer waiting for the relationship to determine your happiness. You're no longer trapped inside endless expectations. You understand what is happening, and that understanding brings peace. The constant overthinking fades. You stop trying to decode every mixed signal. Reality becomes much easier to accept for what it truly is. At that point, one of two things usually happens. Either they begin meeting you with greater consistency, or they slowly disappear from your life. Not because you forced either outcome, but because the old dynamic can no longer survive. If genuine feelings existed beneath the inconsistency, your growth often creates an opportunity for reflection. They realize your emotional availability is no longer guaranteed. They can no longer depend on the relationship continuing without effort. Now they face a choice. Either they begin showing up differently, or they walk away. Sometimes that realization encourages real change. They begin recognizing habits they previously ignored. They become more intentional, more consistent. Not perfect overnight, but noticeably different. The relationship itself changes because both people have changed. But even if they return with better intentions, you don't abandon everything you've learned. You no longer ignore warning signs. You no longer accept inconsistent effort simply because you're afraid of losing the connection. If the relationship continues, it does so on a stronger foundation built on mutual effort, honesty, and emotional stability instead of confusion and pursuit. And if nothing changes, if the inconsistency continues exactly as before, something equally powerful happens. You let go. Not because you're angry, not because you've emotionally collapsed, but because you finally see reality clearly. You understand that connection alone isn't enough. Potential without action cannot build a healthy relationship. Waiting for someone to become who they repeatedly show they are not only delays your healing, it delays your life. That realization sets you free. You stop living for what could happen someday. You begin living according to what is true today. And from that place, everything changes. The chasing ends. The waiting ends. Hope is no longer confused with emotional dependence. You move forward carrying something much more valuable: clarity, stability, self-respect. Perhaps the most meaningful lesson of all is this: no matter which ending unfolds, you no longer lose yourself. If they grow alongside you, you meet them from a place of strength. If they remain the same, you leave with that same strength. Because what once felt like unbearable confusion was quietly teaching you something much greater. It was teaching you to stop mistaking uncertainty for love. Once that lesson truly sinks in, every future relationship begins looking different. You stop pursuing emotional highs. You begin seeking genuine compatibility. You stop chasing attention. You value consistency instead. You stop sacrificing yourself just to preserve a connection. You finally choose yourself first. And when you do, the relationships that belong in your life no longer depend on confusion to survive. In the end, this journey was never only about understanding another person. It was about understanding yourself. It revealed how easily emotional intensity can disguise itself as love, how inconsistency strengthens attachment, and how unfinished emotional experiences can quietly occupy your thoughts for far longer than they should. Most importantly, it showed you that everything begins changing the moment you stop abandoning yourself. You no longer wait for someone else to give you the clarity you deserve. You no longer measure your value by whether someone stays or leaves. Instead, you begin creating emotional stability from within. And that is where true growth begins. Real healing doesn't happen because life finally gives you the ending you hoped for. It happens when you no longer need that ending in order to feel whole. Whether they come back or never return, whether they change or remain exactly the same, your future is no longer defined by their choices. It's defined by yours. And that is the real ending to this story. You don't lose people when you choose yourself. You finally stop losing yourself trying to hold on to people who were never meeting you with the same consistency you were giving them. The greatest transformation isn't getting someone to choose you. It's reaching the point where your peace no longer depends on their decision. When you choose clarity, consistency, and self-respect over confusion and chasing, you don't just heal the relationship you have with others, you heal the relationship you have with yourself. And that's where real emotional freedom begins. If you found this video valuable, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our weekly insights.